Deadly anti-government and pro-human rights protests across Colombia are intensifying. Several demonstrators have been killed and thousands more injured during clashes with police. Protests began more than 2 weeks ago. While the number of deaths is disputed, activist groups say at least 41 people have died. The government claims that number is much lower. Regardless of those figures, Colombia's national police director pledged to punish any member of the national police force who is responsible for any violence or abuse against protesters. Joining us now to talk about what's happening in Colombia is Reuters Colombia correspondent Oliver Griffin. Hi, Oliver. Thanks for joining us. So can you bring us up to date on the sorts of abuses police are being accused of, and have there already been charges brought against any officers since the announcement that violence and abuse will not be tolerated?
Hi. So police here stand accused of killing a number of civilians during protests, of committing certain human rights violations during the course of the protests that we've seen, which started on April 28th. The Attorney General's office has so far confirmed 14. As you mentioned, those numbers are sort of, that's 14 deaths. Those numbers are disputed. Local rights groups say that's much higher, as do international rights groups. The Human Rights Watch says it has received credible reports of 49 deaths during the course of these protests, of which one is a police officer, and it has sort of confirmed 16. So far, the police say they have launched 122 disciplinary proceedings against police officers since the protests began, and 3 have been charged on murder charges tied to civilian deaths.
These protests were apparently sparked by pandemic-related tax reforms, correct, but have since morphed into something else. Can you explain the demands and grievances that are coming into play here?
Yeah, so it did definitely start in response to a proposed tax reform, which had a number of very, very unpopular items in it. Poverty increased quite dramatically over the course of the pandemic. And the lockdowns that we saw last year. But talking to people in the streets as they march since that sort of reform was withdrawn and the former finance minister resigned, what you get a sense of now is just a huge sort of theme of wider frustrations. There's frustrations with police brutality, with a lack of opportunity, a lack of employment, problems with education, general corruption, killings of social leaders and community leaders across parts of the country. And it seems that talking to people, there's just a very deep level of frustration in response to all sorts of grievances that have sort of been building slowly over the course of years. We saw protests in 2019, then we saw them again in 2020, and they start from different things, but then they always come back to these themes of that we've just discussed.
So how have government leaders been responding to the ongoing protests, and what kind of economic impact are these protests having on both the national and local levels?
So the government has once again promised a dialogue, which is something we saw after previous protests. Civil society groups are particularly skeptical of what those might achieve, given that, following previous protests, maybe not a lot has really happened. On an economic level, the new finance minister has sort of warned that the roadblocks and what the government says are acts of vandalism have cost the economy maybe $1.6 billion since the protest began. And the agriculture minister has reported that around 700,000 tons of food have been halted due to sort of these kind of blockages that we've seen in parts across the country. Colombia's economy shrank 6.8% in 2020 following the sort of 5-month lockdown that started at the end of March, and that sort of effect that we saw there. And although it kind of rebounded, grew 1.1% in the first quarter of this year, we've seen analysts warning that if the protests continue for much longer, they could eventually have an impact on the sort of wider economy and the economic recovery that they're sort of hoping for this year.
Right, definitely economic pressures at play there. Well, Oliver Griffin in Bogota, Colombia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.